Hello, this is Raymond, and welcome to the show. I'm joined today with two very special guest hosts, Professor Anders Sandberg from the Future of Humanity Institute, and Laurie Pycroft, streaming as post-normal from the Oxford Functional Neurosurgery. Our guest today is a household name in the field of psychology and beyond, and we're more than honored to have him on today. Professor David Dunning is Professor of Psychology at the University of Michigan. With an interest in decision-making, human misbelief, and the self, he's probably most well known for his 1999 paper co-authored with Justin Kruger, Unskilled and Unaware of It, How Difficulties in Recognizing One's Own Incompetence Leads to Inflated Self-Assessments, as well as the subsequent cognitive bias and half his namesake, the Dunning-Kruger Effect. Professor Dunning, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us.
Thank you for having me.
So I thought it would be nice to maybe start from the very basics for our audience who might not be familiar with your work. What is the Dunning-Kruger effect defined by David Dunning himself, and has it changed over time?
Well, the Dunning-Kruger effect actually is a family of effects, but in popular culture, the culture has focused on one aspect of it, which is that incompetent people don't know, scratch that, they can't know that they're incompetent. That is, in not only performing, but judging your performance. You need expertise to be able to accurately judge a performance, as well as come up with the right thing to do. And if you don't have expertise, if you don't have know-how, you're going to make a lot of mistakes, obviously, but you're also not going to have the expertise to recognize those choices as mistakes. And so often people who are going the wrong way, so to speak, doing something suboptimal, to be diplomatic, are simply not in a position to recognize that this is what they're doing. They lack the very expertise they need to recognize that they lack expertise.
Maybe tell us a bit more about the history of the Dunning-Kruger effect. So how did you come up with it? And maybe tell us about some of the experiments you did to measure it.
Sure. I mean, I have a long-standing interest in how well we follow the old Delphic admonition to know ourselves. I mean, do we have an accurate grasp of our competence and of our character? And so naturally, I was looking for psychological dynamics that might produce lack of self-knowledge. And just over the years, I noticed that a lot of people said outrageous things on television, in my office, and so forth, or at least I thought they were outrageous. And I would sit there and kind of go, don't you recognize that what you just said is a little bit off? But I kept that at the back of my head. And one day, Justin Kruger walked into my office, said he wanted to work with me. And I said, well, I have this high risk-reward idea. I would really like to know if poor performers, people who don't know simply logic, don't have a good sense of humor, are grammatically unskilled, how much they recognize their deficits. And so we went off and did the studies. And I remember to this day being stunned at how little people who do little knew about their shortcomings, their mistakes. They were just, in our experiments, blithely unaware. So what we would do is take Cornell students and give them tasks that they should know. I mean, they're academic tasks like analytical or logical reasoning or grammar, and test them out and ask them how well they'd done on the test. And pretty much what we got is people on average thought they were way above average. That's not a surprise in psychology. People tend to overestimate themselves. But people at the very bottom, let's say the bottom 25%, thought they were beating out 65% of their peers. They were overestimating how well they were doing on these tests by some 30-40%. And that's the gap that came to be known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. And since then, we've tested this in a lot of areas. So we've invaded a trap and skeet shooting contest near Cornell and gave people a pop quiz on firearm safety. And the people, that was one of the rare cases where the people doing the worst on our little quiz actually was created by the National Rifle Association. The people doing the worst were the most confident in their skills about firearm use and safety and care. And other people, for example, have surveyed interns or residents going through a gynecology rotation down at the University of Florida medical school, and those who were flunking the test or doing the worst in the entire rotation tended to think they were going to get a B plus on average. So in a lot of different areas, what you find is people who are performing the worst in intellectual tasks or social tasks, I mean, tasks that require know-how, if you will, tend not to know how little know-how they know.
Do you think, in some ways, the popularization of the DKE changed how you did research later on?
I'd have to say it did. It took a little while, though, because we did the piece, and it famously was the piece I sort of looked at and said, I don't know how to follow this up. So I went off and did work in other areas, in particular looking at motivated reasoning, wishful thinking, if you will, and seeing how much that drove thought all the way down to below thought, namely literally what you saw or what you heard in the environment could be shaped by what you wanted to see and what you wanted to avoid. So I was looking at active self-deception. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is inadvertent self-deception. You're trying to be honest, you're trying to be impartial, but you just don't have the knowledge base to accurately assess yourself or other people. But the world kept coming back, and reporters kept coming back. They wanted to know about this ignorance thing. And so I'm cycled back now to a number of projects in the past 5 years and continuing, looking at what are the specific issues that are underlying the Dunning-Kruger effect, because the issue of poor performance or ignorance or incompetence is really you have a botany of different animals down there. Different people are suffering this lack of knowledge for different reasons, and we're trying to sort it all out, what's going on there, and also looking at further implications of the fact that poor performers don't know that they're poor performers.
So your research has certainly affected me as a very interdisciplinary researcher. I'm now constantly racked with this fear that maybe I don't know what I'm doing and I'm totally unaware of that. So at least I'm trying to counteract it, but that is of course tricky. So there is a good question we got from the Oxford Psychology Society. Which individual differences actually do account for the variation in the extent to which one gets this bias? Does intelligence play a role, or personality, or some other factor?
Well, I'd have to say that our original message, and it's a message that still works as a main message or a main point to keep in mind, is that this is an effect that infects everybody. Everybody is vulnerable to it sooner or later. It might be different ways. It might be in different areas of life. Some people might make a more flamboyant masterpiece of their Dunning-Kruger effect, but it's everybody. Nobody's immune. And we have been trying to look at individual differences, but we don't find many of them, if you will. That is, it seems to be that each of us has a pocket, a different set of pockets of incompetence, and in those pockets, we're not aware that we're in them. The one thing I will say, though, because this is individual difference work that we've done, is a surprising individual difference that's relevant actually comes from schizophrenia research, which has taken a look at how much evidence does a person need in a very rarefied artificial task. How much evidence does a person need to say, I know the answer? So literally what happens is you have two urns in front of you. One is a majority of red balls in the urn, one is a majority of white balls in the urn, and I, the experimenter, I'm going to start pulling balls out of one of these urns. And you stop me when you know which urn it is. And so you pull out, ball number one and it's white, and next ball and it's white, the next ball that it's red, and the fourth ball is white. And the key is when does the person say stop, I know, I can make a guess which urn you're drawing from. And in schizophrenia research, what they've discovered is that people who say stop after only one or two balls tend to be much more vulnerable or prone to delusion. And I thought that was interesting. So we imported that into the usual types of judgments and decisions we have people do in my lab and in my field, and discovered that in the general population, there are a lot of people who say stop after one or two balls. And they make many more errors that have been classically defined in more general psychology. And you could say they're more prone to the Dunning-Kruger effect, but what's really going on is they're just much more likely to make errors. And once you've made errors, you are in the pocket of incompetence. So it's not that I don't think they have any more or less insight. They just are much more likely to wander into the zone where the Dunning-Kruger effect kicks in. And that's the only individual difference that we've been able to find is relevant to this phenomenon.
That's interesting. As somebody who sometimes thinks about Bayesian reasoning, etc., it seems that they're kind of doing very quick and dirty. Let's look at the first piece of evidence, and when I'm done, it might be that they don't feel a strong need for cognition about it, or think that they already have enough evidence. Well, I was interested in asking also how applicable the Dunning-Kruger effect is to normal people and experts, respectively. One would assume experts would have acquired a lot of knowledge about the domain, but of course, most domains are rather complex and awkward, and even experts have subparts of their domain that they actually don't use very much or might actually not know very much about.
No, I think that's right. And that's why this is an effect that attaches to everybody sooner or later. That is, experts are more likely to get to the right answer and so be somewhat more immune to the effect. But this is a current project, what we're finding is that when experts make an error or wander into that zone, they really don't know all that much. They are particularly unaware of it. Because there's a tricky thing about expertise. Expertise can get you the right answer, but it can also get you the wrong answer. And your expertise may give your judgment quite the feel of accuracy because it seems what you know is relevant. And the conclusion that you've reached is reasonable and plausible. Typically when I take a look at data, it's good to be an expert. You're going to make more right judgments. But when you make an error, you're particularly not going to be aware of it. So we all have to be aware. And by the way, I mean, the best way to think about the effect is that a lot of this has to do with, or it appears when we're doing things on our own, when we're striking out on our own. So to the extent that we check our work, and invent a second self that's going to check on the first self and disagree or inject doubt or check with other people, that is quite helpful. So the way I would describe to people is don't get paralyzed in terms of pursuing your life and pursuing your expertise, but always do have some doubt. And when it's important, check with other people.
Mm. So that might be the main way of actually getting past this bias, actually having a second pair of eyes looking over what you're doing.
I think that's right. I mean, you're never exactly past the bias, so you're never home free. But there are things you can do to try to reduce the number of times that you fall prey to the bias.
And I've certainly seen a lot of interesting examples of very smart professors around here who are very good experts in many domains and then make amazing mistakes. And it's, of course, very hard to convince them that they don't know what we're talking about because they're a professor.
Oh, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the issue here is you need to know your circle of competence. That is, what's the sphere that you really do know? And there is a difficulty in knowing when you're stepping outside of that circle of competence because often what people aren't aware of, and there's no reason to expect that they're going to be aware of, is when they move to a different field, that there's a different set of skills or a different set of knowledge that they need to know. The problem is that, let's say if you're a mathematician, just to use a COVID example, and you can do growth curves. You think, okay, you're predicting the growth of the virus is a math problem. Let me do the math and figure out where the virus is going to go and how challenging it's going to get. And math is involved. But what a mathematician may not recognize is there's a lot of knowledge about epidemiology, about the limits on growth, and the fact that spread is not random, it's correlated. There are hotspots that occur. As opposed to just this thing pops up in different areas of a country, for example. But the mathematician, being trained in math and not being trained in epidemiology, doesn't know the epidemiology wisdom or concepts or analysis, doesn't know it exists. So it's easy to over-apply the math because the math is plausible. It is part of the problem, but not recognize that it's only part because you don't realize everything else. You just have no clue about everything else that's relevant. Just to give you a jargon term, this is a phenomenon that we refer to in my lab. It's been referred to elsewhere as well. It comes from linguistics. The phenomenon we call is hypo cognition, which is that there are concepts, there are analyses, there are ideas that are out there that are relevant, and you have no idea they exist. And as a consequence, you think what you know is relevant, but you don't realize how much it has to be qualified because you literally have no idea the concepts you need to know if you're going to do something that lies outside of your circle of competence.
Yeah, and of course, in these times where everybody's an armchair epidemiologist, there's probably going to be quite a lot of hypocognition going on. But also perhaps a fair number of armchair epidemiologists who are aware that they are armchair epidemiologists, which might actually be quite helpful.
No, I think that's right, but we don't see them, or they qualify their what they're saying appropriately. But a few cases escape where people don't realize, if you will, that they're just being armchair, if you will, or that if you're an outsider to a field, the way that outsiders have an impact, and outsiders can have an impact in the field. They can be very worthwhile to have in the conversation, but they have to have a conversation with people who have expertise in that field as well. So I'm sure there are a lot of armchair epidemiologists who have folded themselves into teams that are doing quite good work because they have a team with a lot of different expertise and a lot of different ideas, a lot of different circles of competence there. But there are some lone wolves, and it may not be the general case, but it certainly is. There have been some visible cases of armchair epidemiology where people strike out alone. Not recognizing the idea that if they're going to do something that lies outside their usual circle of competence, the wise thing to do is to do that in a team, not as a lone wolf.
Oh, yeah. So a final question from me is, there are some cognitive biases like anchoring that even if you know about it, it's very hard to deal with because it's such a low-level process probably in our cognition. So how impenetrable is the Dunning-Kruger effect? There are some visual illusions, for example, like the checker shadow illusion, but even when you've seen that you have the illusion, you still can't make your mind actually recognize that the two pieces of checkerboard actually have the same shade. Are there similar things going on when incompetent people find out that they're incompetent? Is it that they still cannot get out of that, or do they actually get a bit better when they get the evidence?
Well, this actually may be where individual differences are where our reaction to finding out they're incompetent is really a different domain of psychology than the original Dunning-Kruger effect itself. Now, the Dunning-Kruger effect itself is often impenetrable to people. So we've done things like paid people or promised to pay people up to $100 for coming up with correct assessments about how well or how poorly they're doing. And you really get people's attention, but it does nothing to the accuracy of their judgments. Excuse me. But it's a different situation, which is equally interesting, if not more interesting, when you confront people with the fact that they don't know. And there you do step into the realm of wishful thinking, defensiveness, rationalization, and suddenly it's not a pure cognitive or intellectual problem. The Dunning-Kruger effect, if you strip away everything else, there's still a purely intellectual problem. You're just not in a position to know. But if you're confronted with the idea that you don't know, sometimes people are going to react with, oh, I've learned something about myself. Fantastic. And in our work, we find that tends to be the norm. But then you do get reactions, and I won't say it's an individual difference, but it's certainly a different reaction, where people just deny, or they obfuscate, or they resist the information. Now we're in the realm of self-deception, if you will. And we found this to be an extremely interesting set of phenomena in of itself. So, for example, in business schools in the United States, it's quite common to test people on their emotional intelligence and then give them feedback about their emotional intelligence. And there's a standard test out there that has some validity behind it that business schools use. But we attached ourselves to a few business school classes during the time that the students were getting feedback. And they got feedback. And in one study, one of the questions we asked was, okay, you've gotten feedback on this, on your emotional intelligence. You're in a business school. Look, as part of this work, one thing we can offer you is this book called The Emotionally Intelligent Manager. We can give you a huge discount on it. Do you want to buy the book? And we found out that people's performance greatly affected, or at least was connected to, their interest in the book. So, but maybe not in the way you would think. So of the people in the top 25%, I think like 60% of them, 2/3 of them said, I'll buy the book. And by the way, yeah, they had to buy the book. They had to bring the money, and we had the books and everything. And when you went down to the poor performers, the bottom 25%, 25% of only 25% of them were interested in buying the book. So, and this is a semi-surprise. It turns out that people often are very much interested in pursuing education in things they're already good at and avoiding education where they're weak. That's sort of well known in a lot of different areas. Doctors, and talking about continuing education, physicians will talk about that all the time. But to get back to this point that this might be more self-deception than an intellectual problem, is a follow-up study we did where, okay, people took the test, they're going to get feedback, but in one group we asked people, okay, how valid do you think the test was? In another group we asked, okay, how relevant is this emotional intelligence stuff to your life? Okay, got that ready. They get their feedback. And then afterward, we ask them, okay, everybody, how accurate do you think the test is, or how valid do you think is the test? How relevant is the skill? And what we found is that people who perform poorly would stick to their original opinion on the question we'd asked before. So if we'd asked them, is the test accurate? They say, yeah, the test is accurate. Oh, but this really isn't relevant at all to life. And the group that had rated the relevance of emotional intelligence before still thought it was relevant, but this test is just completely invalid. So one of the problems that people have in terms of getting feedback is if you give them an escape route, or some of them, certainly enough of them, an escape route to dismiss the result, they take that escape route. And that I thought was very telling, but that has to do with if you're dealing with other people or you're dealing with yourself, make sure you're not taking the escape route. A lot of the time, people can deal with negative information. Sometimes we can't, and we're all prone to looking for escape routes. That's the thing to avoid.
Yeah, sounds like one really needs to keep on updating one's opinions.
No, I think that's right. In fact, one of the things I tell my students is that a goal in life is to always be vaguely embarrassed by anything you've done before. If you can see the mistakes in it, if you can say, I could have done that better, if you're sort of embarrassed, this is what you did, good. That probably means you're developing. If you're completely satisfied with something you did before, that's the thing I'm worried about. It means you're not paying attention and you aren't maturing, so to speak.
So I was particularly interested in, I've got a few questions. I'm particularly interested in exploring the positive side of the Dunning-Kruger effect, since it's such a universal effect, and something I think part of the reason it's become so popular, on the internet and now spreading throughout popular culture more broadly, is because it's such an obvious thing once you hear about it. You observe it in stupid people everywhere. You observe it in smart people everywhere. Nobel laureates coming out and saying some of the dumbest things just outside their field. So for something that is so well kind of conserved, what do you think are the benefits? I guess first, this question from the Psychology Society, on a evolutionary and kind of societal level.
Well, I think there are a number of ways to think about it in terms of the adaptability of the effect. I think one of the things the effect reveals is we can have wrong opinions, but nothing's really ever going to come of it. So I watch a lot of European football. I have a lot of opinions about coaches and how they're managing their team or managing their players, but nothing's ever going to come of my opinions. So I could be displaying a lot of Dunning-Kruger, but it doesn't mean anything. I entertain myself. No one gets hurt. And in my expertise, I can have a lot of pleasant feelings and certainly not feel stress, if you will. I mean, one of the things about overestimating yourself is you avoid the stress of underestimating yourself, or maybe truly knowing yourself when there's no self to underestimate, if you will. So there's that. But the other take that that I often talk about is that evolution has made us skilled in terms of the tasks that we do. There are some tasks where I don't think there's been enough time for natural selection to act on, or they're evolutionarily relevant, like astrophysics, for example, or advanced calculus, for example. But the issue with evolution is that it's evolved to make us good enough, but very far from perfect. So it's not a surprise that we still have imperfections. It's not evolution doesn't prevent us from being idiots. It prevents us from being blithering idiots. But there's still a lot of idiocy that can occur and that we observe in others, not necessarily the self all the time. But I think not knowing what you don't know, and that's at the heart of what we're talking about today, that's a particularly tough evolutionary barrier or obstacle or challenge to surmount. So I often think of the Dunning-Kruger effect, or not knowing what you don't know, is the challenge that evolution hasn't succeeded at yet. It's still a challenge for evolution. Oh, but by the way, I should mention, though, that in terms of having confidence, there are times in which being confident, maybe even being unrealistically confident, really is helpful. So let's say that I'm a general, I'm going to war, I've come up with a plan, and today is the day of battle. I want to be incredibly confident as much as possible, even if my plan is a failure, because it's very likely that following the plan is going to lead to success, and I need to inspire my troops. So that's a moment in which being incredibly confident is very important. Or a doctor telling a patient a treatment regimen. The doctor knows they may not be right. They're more likely to be right or not, but the odds are the patient will be better if the patient follows the regimen. So doctors express confidence because it produces better outcomes overall, even though locally it may produce errors. Now, that's where confidence is helpful when adopting it is going to raise your chances of success. But beforehand, before that day of battle, I don't want a general who's overly confident. I want a general who's scared. I want a general who's going to over-prepare. They're going to have too much ordnance. They're going to have too many troops. They're going to have lots of contingency plans that they've carefully laid out. They're going to wonder about, what don't I know? For example, what's the intelligence that I can glean from whatever intelligence source I can get to? I want someone who is scared and over-prepared. But the day of the battle, I want that general and the doctor coming up with a diagnosis. I want a doctor who's considering all the differential diagnoses they can, and not just deciding on one really quickly and then going with that. But on the day of battle, whether it be in the doctor's office or on the battlefield, now is the time to be confident, when it's time to execute. So there are a lot of ways to think about the advantages and disadvantages of overconfidence, both in evolutionary terms or on that time scale, or let's say in the more day-to-day time scale.
Yeah, I was particularly thinking about this in terms of people like politicians or CEOs, where, as you said, with kind of doctors and generals, there seems to be inherent value in appearing confident, in signaling that confidence, even if one's actually lacking it. Of course, there are some politicians we could point towards who have very strong, very confident opinions, not naming any names, of course,
no, of course not.
no, on specific topics, say regarding, use of bleach in certain treatments or whatever, and to their electoral base, that seems like an advantage, that being able to signal, I'm the smartest guy, I've got the smartest teams on board, and I know everything about all of these topics. That seems to have electoral benefit. But when it comes to actually doing the things that politicians should be doing, as you say, you want the general to have stacked up all of his ammunition and prepared properly, and you probably don't want a politician who is taking advice from fortune tellers or from the passing thoughts in his morning shower. So I was just thinking, how do we, I guess, on a societal level and as a polity, kind of balance? I suppose this is probably a bit of a big question for this one talk, but how do we balance the desire to have confident leaders who give us hope and don't cause us excess worry, versus those who have unfounded confidence?
Well, I think that's a very good point, or something that people should be more attuned to. That is one of the themes that you find in work on judgments and decisions in psychology, is that people are very sensitive to or responsive to the strength of the message, the confidence of the message that they're getting. And people give short shrift to the question of credibility. Is this something I really should believe? That is, the message is strong, but it has nothing to do with whether it's a reliable message or an unreliable message. And so what I would recommend, especially moving forward in such an information-rich environment, is we have to develop more day-to-day skills in assessing the credibility of messages. So if someone is talking about bleach, can they bring the report or their team of interdisciplinary experts that are saying, yes, bleach is the way to do this? Or does it just look like a passing thought, for example? Does this person typically just say what's in the head at the moment? Or are they saying something that shows reflection of some preparation beforehand, some documentation beforehand? I think people really have to, both individually and as a society, really talk about not what the message is, but rather what's the signal that it's a credible message, a reliable message, or not. And I'll just tell you that there are many skills, either as a society or individual, that we could develop more. We haven't really developed them reliably yet. So this is suggested by the psychological literature. But given a situation from here on out where we're going to be awash in information, misinformation, those are going to be skills. In this case, the assessment of credibility, that it would be terrifically important to develop to a higher degree.
Absolutely. And I think this is particularly pertinent, unfortunately, at the moment, in the midst of the pandemic, where we're attempting to assess the credibility not only of politicians who, we maybe have a baseline expectation that they're going to lie a bit and they're going to engage in puffery and so on and so forth, but also in a lot of experts, many of whom may be talking about subjects that are outside of their field of expertise. I've seen a lot of normal, general practitioners and surgeons and virologists and so forth being roped into talking about epidemiology, which, though they no doubt have some education, they're not specialists in. And it becomes very difficult to assess that signal of credibility when you've got the politicians on one hand trying to sort of super signal credibility, and the doctors trying to navigate the media landscape while media figures are painting them as possessing expertise they don't have.
I think, and by the way, just to bring in some terminology, because people tend to find it useful, the idea that I'm an expert in one field, but now I'm speaking outside my circle of competence, for example, into epidemiology, which is the situation that we're in now. Along with philosopher Nathan Ballantyne, we've been working on epistemic trespassing, which is dismissing experts in one field and you trespass into their field, and what's behind that. But I think you're right. I think the media, us individually, policymakers do have to be thinking more about the issue of credibility. Is this a person or that's epistemic trespassing, for example? But there's another thing I'd like to point out about the epidemic and COVID-19, which is in some sense, in a way, we're all not experts in this. We're all trespassing into something we really don't know. This is a different virus. It acts differently. We may have crucial knowledge that's going to help us defeat the virus, but we're going to get some things wrong. And experts, true experts, are going to have to change what they say in terms of what it means in terms of cases, the future deaths. There are going to be different messages because we all really started out, in a sense, in Dunning-Kruger at the beginning of this. This is a novel situation. We don't know what we don't know. There are a lot of unknown unknowns. And experts now are learning at an incredibly impressive rate. I mean, it's astonishing how much we've learned about the virus and combating it, and there's more to come. But so the skill I think we also have to develop is recognizing when we're in a situation where no one really knows that we have information. I mean, in our lifetimes, there have been pandemics, Ebola, for example, or H1N1, for example. There are historical records from the Spanish flu back in 1918. But this is a new thing, and that information and that knowledge is going to be useful, but there are going to be contradictions to that information. We're going to learn. And so people have to recognize when they're in a situation of uncertainty, where the uncertainty is going to last for a while, that you're going to have to act and act fast, not in a position of knowledge, but in a position of uncertainty, and know that you still have to act, and know that the story is going to have to change. And the issue that I see is that a lot of media commentators, when projections change, or when treatment, a proposed treatment or proposed interventions change, like should you wear a mask in public or not wear a mask in public, things like that, people kind of go, oh, the experts don't know anything. No, the experts are learning, and we have to recognize the situation that we're in. And that things are going to evolve. What we will know 6 months from now will be far different and far better developed than what we know now. And we also, by the way, do have to always have a little bit of doubt, or put an asterisk beside anything that we do think moving ahead. So one of the things I find interesting, and this is the thing that I myself am tracking, is that at least in the United States, there's a thought that this virus will be like the flu, it will disappear in the summer. And that's plausible, but we don't know that for sure because Singapore, Australia are having outbreaks even in vastly warmer summer-like situations. But we're importing knowledge that we have, the flu, into this virus, and that's likely to give us a lot of correct guesses about what to do about this virus. But we should always have an asterisk about our assumptions about what else we can assume, for which it's unknown, we don't have evidence, we don't have the experience. So I think one of the skills that at a societal all the way down to an individual level, we're going to have to learn how to know which pieces of knowledge or inference we think we have. Well, we should attach an asterisk to it. It's probably right, but it may not be right. And we shouldn't just be 100% confident in what we assume the road will be ahead, or assume what the best action is to take. So a long-winded answer to your question. I'm not actually sure it's an answer to your question, but I did want to point it out.
I thought it was an interesting discussion around the topic, and that's what I was asking the question for, so I'm very happy with it. How does David Dunning live with the Dunning-Kruger effect? So given that you know all of these things and you are literally the expert on this topic, how has it affected your life and your academic life, knowing how little we all know?
Well, I think one stance I've adopted is when I'm wrong, I'm not surprised anymore, if you will. I mean, we all have to take actions. We all have to live with this aspect of the human condition, if you will. But I just want to become more aware of its effects when they become visible to me. So what do I do about the Dunning-Kruger effect? It's hard for me because I have my pockets of incompetence and I don't know what they are. But when they get exposed, I don't fight it as much. But I think the other buzzword or term to think about is intellectual humility. That is, you don't want to get paralyzed, and you don't want to overanalyze. But when a situation is significant, when there are consequences, I think it's important to think it through. Think about ways that you could be wrong, about decisions that you are considering, how each one might lead to disaster. There's a wonderful exercise called a premortem that has been suggested that when you decide on a course of action, say, okay, let's say I take this course of action, and 5 years from now, it's a complete disaster. What led to that disaster? That turns out to be a very effective way to figure out what might be wrong with your plan. So I do consider how I might be wrong. But I also a little bit more willing to listen to disagreement, dissent. I give it a fairer hearing, simply because my wrong decisions are going to be invisible to me unless I take it. And some of them I can avoid if I just take a little extra care when it matters. Don't want to overthink on everything. Don't have that much time in the day. But when it matters, I'm just willing to consider the possibility I might be wrong, consider other people's opinions. And when things go wrong, I kind of go, okay, that's a learning experience. And I'll go from there.
I wish I could force just about everyone in the world right now to listen to that couple of minutes, because I think that's something the world really needs to hear. Okay, I'll hand it over to Anders then.
So here's a question we ask all our guests. So if you had all the funding in the world to investigate anything you wanted, what would it be?
Oh, that's extremely interesting. There are a lot of possibilities, but let me just switch the topic a little bit to just a Gordian knot of a set of issues that is very important for day-to-day life and society at large that we really understand at an individual level, but at a scientific conscious level we don't understand. And that's the influence of norms of behavior and how they influence us. That is, there's a grammar to language, but there's also a grammar to behavior. Now, it changes a little bit from culture to culture, but we are all following rules that make life less nasty, brutish, and short, make society possible. But at a conscious level, we have no understanding of what's going on. And I know this because we've done work on trust. And when are people willing to trust a complete stranger they'll never see and never interact with again? And according to the economists, you should not trust another person in that situation. Are you crazy? But people do. A majority of people do, even though they could get hurt financially. And even more confounding, other people actually honor that trust. But if you go to the person who trusted the complete stranger and ask them what led them to do that, they have no idea. And that has clued me into the idea that there is a tremendous genius. You could put it in our genes, or you could put it in the way we've constructed our civilizations that produce rules that people faithfully follow and have no idea of their existence. And I would ask for a lot of money simply because we spent 12 years trying to explain why people trust other people in situations where the economists would say, no way should people trust. So it's going to take a lot of people, a lot of brains, and a lot of money to figure out the entire grammar of our behavior.
Yeah, I see that every autumn at the queue for the bus when I take at home, because every year in Oxford there are students coming from a lot of different cultures, and they don't understand the British queue. The Brits, of course, are queuing in the proper British manner, and then in October the students show up and they don't follow the rules, and the British are very annoyed. And over the span of a few months, by November, December, everybody is queuing in a British manner. Nobody has ever said anything explicitly about this is not the right way of queuing, but people pick it up. The scaled up, of course, trust is one of the most important factors for keeping societies together and successful. So I agree, this is research that probably some billionaires should be throwing billions at making you research.
I know, because it is the place where it works, where people make right decisions well beyond their understanding. And usually my research is about how the breakdowns, if you will, how people get things wrong or are unaware. And here we have an unawareness, but people show our ability to coordinate with one another, even in new situations or new societies where we have to learn how to coordinate. That genius is just something to behold, but people don't. If you don't think about it, you don't see it, and you don't recognize it, you don't appreciate it. So I wouldn't mind really trying to break down what's behind that genius.
So my sort of last question, it's a sort of special ending question, is that I have a terrible habit of stalking our interviewers on Twitter, and I noticed that there was quite an interesting tweet lately. You posted something about a nominee for the most paradigmatic Dunning-Kruger case, Richard Epstein, who has a controversial article about the coronavirus in the Trump administration. And I was wondering if you've ever heard of the Darwin Award.
Oh, absolutely. I've heard of the Darwin Award. When we first started out the work, I was looking for examples of this effect, and so I immediately looked to see if there were any Darwin Award candidates that we could talk about where you want to be kind to people. So, and we could also verify the story was real. And at that point, in the mid '90s, a lot of the stories were apocryphal. They weren't necessarily real. Now they're real, and I check in every 6 months or so because of Twitter, because of this crisis, because of the Darwin Awards. I'm always looking for examples that are intriguing in terms of reflecting something that might be relevant to my research. And now the Darwin Awards is a very rich source of examples that inspires a lot of thinking. So I don't know if there's a specific example you're thinking of. There's not a specific example I'm thinking of, but I wonder if there's anything that you're thinking of.
What I was thinking of actually was more if right here, right now, we could create the Dunning-Kruger Award, which is sort of the psychological version of the Darwin Award. And I was wondering if you could think of, I'm sure you have a lot of nominees in your head, but I was wondering if you could think of the winner of this year's, the first annual Dunning-Kruger Award.
Oh, that's a very good question, because the pandemic has exposed a lot of our epistemic failings at the individual or the societal level. I mean, in some sense, as a person who's looking for raw material to use to guide research or to guide thinking, a lot of truths are being revealed, both socially and intellectually, about our societies and about us. And it's, I'm going to semi-dodge your question because I don't know next week there might be a better candidate. So the person I talked about in the tweet was a lawyer who knew a little evolution and basically said we need to expose people to this virus because the only version of the virus that will remain is the weaker version of the virus, and we'll be able to defeat that one. And there's no basis for this analysis whatsoever. But the reason why I said it was a classic Dunning-Kruger example is the person knew something that could lead to an answer, but they thought that was the universe of all that you needed to know to make a confident proclamation. And he went and he did, and I think he said we'll top out at 500 cases in the United States. Well, there's still a top that's unknown. but every week I sort of look and there's a new candidate. So I think the only appropriate thing, the only appropriate person to nominate for the inaugural award, the person I would most like to nominate is each and every single one of us. Because the key thing to remember is that this is not about them, it is about us, and it is about me, if you will. Some people may make it more flamboyant. Some people may make it more of a disaster, but we're all going to confront our own personal disasters that have bad outcomes for ourselves and for the, other people and people we care about. That has to be the first candidate to designate as the recipient of the Dunning-Kruger Award. Another way to put it, and this also comes from Twitter, a long time ago in a tweet far, far away, someone once tweeted the first rule of the Dunning-Kruger Club is you don't know you're in Dunning-Kruger Club. If there's any ending takeaway I want people to leave with, that's the takeaway I want them to leave with.
On that note, thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Dunning.
Thank you. Very great questions, great discussion. So thank you and what you're doing.
It was lovely chatting
This was
with you.
epic.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
We hope that we'll see you for the second Dunning-Kruger Effect Award.